Congressional Republicans have attempted to continue Ukraine funding to drastic policy changes on the southern border, changes that the Biden administration seems to be taking seriously. The White House indicated it would be willing to support a new border authority to expel incoming migrants without asylum screenings and expand migrant detention and deportation procedures in exchange for foreign aid.
Congressional Democrats have attempted to paint Republican efforts to tie border policy to Ukraine spending as short-sighted and dangerous. During last Sunday's edition of Meet the Press, Senator Chris Murphy claimed that if Republicans didn't give up on pushing border policy, Russia would march into Ukraine and China would be given a green light to invade Taiwan. Watch.
Republicans would argue, many of them, they're not calling to completely shut down the border, but as you say, to make it tougher to get through. If you look at the poll numbers, the latest Wall Street Journal poll shows a whopping 64% of people disapprove of President Biden's handling of the border. Does that add pressure on you, on Democrats, to get something done here?
Well, listen, I'm not paying attention to the politics here. What I know is that the future of the world is at stake. If we fail, if Republicans don't get reasonable in the next 24 to 48 hours, Russia is going to march into Ukraine. China is going to be given a green light to invade Taiwan. The world for my children is fundamentally different under that scenario. The United States security is at risk. So I am just beside myself that Republicans are playing games with the security of the world.
Here to discuss the border and how immigration is shaping the American political landscape, our investigative immigration reporter at the Daily Caller, Jennie Taer, and humanitarian activist Charls McBryde. Welcome to the show, both of you. Charles, I want to start with you. You've been on the ground in Ukraine during wartime. What do you make of what Chris Murphy is saying there about international security? And what do you make of these two issues being tied to each other by our members of Congress?
Afternoon, Jessica. I'm in a rare position of agreeing with Chris Murphy completely here. I think the United States commitment to Ukraine is absolutely essential, and what used to be a cut and dry bipartisan issue is quickly becoming a very contested one. The Republicans are attempting to tie a foreign policy necessity to a domestic dispute, and they are using it as to ransom Congress in order to get their domestic agenda pushed through. I think that's entirely inappropriate, given that the conditions regarding the war in Ukraine are incredibly volatile, happening from a foreign policy standpoint, and they have nothing to do with the domestic troubles at the U.S. border.
Let's bring Jennie in here because, Jennie, you can speak to the border perspective of this issue. You've been to the border several times for your reporting. Can you speak to the fact that the border is not just a domestic dispute, but also a national security issue because of the lack of screening of people who are coming across?
Absolutely. That's what's been happening for years now under the Biden administration. And we've seen, even memos going out recently. We obtained one that Border Patrol had received about the potential of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist groups seizing on the border situation right now, seizing on the fact that catch and release is occurring. And that's exactly what Republicans don't want out of a supplemental funding bill right now.
So I want to quickly follow up. Have there been cases where folks have been detained at the border and have been proven to be jihadists or members of Hamas?
Not at the moment. We've seen certain cases where people have slipped through the cracks in different ways, been released by released by local authorities. ICE has tried to issue detainers on individuals that are of national security concerns, people who have been released by Border Patrol, and then they find out later that that person was actually a fugitive from their country. And the problem is that people slip through the cracks because right now, the priority is efficiency. And so when you're trying to get people out of custody, sometimes within 48 hours, you don't have time to get the information back from the home country. And a lot of these countries are recalcitrant as well.
Charles, what do you make of this case that border security, is a threat to national security as it relates to the conflict in Israel-Palestine?
I think manufacturing a moral panic about Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas members infiltrating through the southern border is exactly what I would expect from today's Republican Party. I think it's a completely groundless accusation and just a way to stir up moral panic around the border crisis to tie it to current events. I think something that's rather interesting is that some of the population that's coming through the southern border and through the northern border with Canada are actually Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing from the war in Ukraine, which is a very real national security threat, both to the United States and to the Western democracies in Europe, rather than kind of a manufactured idea about Hamas militants sneaking through our southern border. There's just absolutely nothing to back that up.
Well, I would point out that there have been several suspected Hamas terrorists arrested in Europe by sneaking across the border there, seeking to gain weapons with which to attack Israelis. But on the question of the border as well, it's not just Hamas terrorism that's a potential issue. Jenny, the Daily Caller has reported on the fact that known or suspected terrorists from other countries have also made their way into the United States through the porous border.
Yeah, and I would also say that through the 9/11 Commission report, we did find that there was a nexus with the southern border that Congress had found, that was reported. That was one of the ways that terrorists were trying to infiltrate the country. In addition to that, there was a plot to assassinate George W. Bush that was also thwarted that had a nexus to the southern border.
So I want to talk a little bit about, these two issues being tied together and funding being held in suspense. Matt Gaetz, when, we had the whole McCarthy debacle, was really fighting for this kind of exchange of his vote and his faction, the Freedom Caucus's vote for a speaker, in exchange for essentially piecemealing funding, voting issue by issue. I think the border issue requires policies that will take months, if not years, to devise and perfect. Whereas the war in Ukraine is a much more urgent situation. Charles, do you think that's a fair comparison there and a reason perhaps why these two policies shouldn't be tied together, especially when it comes to funding right now?
I think you're absolutely correct, Jessica. The war in Ukraine is a separate issue as far as I see it. It's a very clear policy stance from the United States, which is to give as many weapons as possible to the Ukrainians as they resist Russian fascism. What's happening at the southern border is an ongoing dispute that's been going on for decades and something that's going to take a really long time and a lot of various policy proposals to deal with. And the implementation of those is going to take a lot longer than the implementation of immediate aid to Ukraine. And one is far more urgent than the other.
Charles, a follow-up for you there. How much money do you think the U.S. would have to send in order for Ukraine to have a shot at winning this war? And what do you see as a reasonable conclusion? Are both sides going to have to come to negotiations and reach some kind of peace deal? Or does Ukraine have basically a snowball's chance in hell at actually defeating Russia?
Ukraine has far more than a snowball's chance in hell. They've had the Russians on the ropes for the past year and a half and have liberated vast swaths of Ukrainian territory that was taken in the earlier part of the year. I think there's a fiction that some people in the United States live under, that this is NATO's war or this is some sort of proxy war between the United States and Russia. I've been to Ukraine. I've talked to Ukrainians, and they are in this fight for themselves. They're going to continue fighting whether or not we help them, but the best thing that we can do is send them money. And I think Americans also labor under this illusion that we're just bringing duffel bags full of cash and dropping them in Zelensky's office. That's not what this is. Lethal aid to Ukraine typically consists of dragging up a bunch of old military equipment out of storage, stuff that's been almost obsolete for the past 20 to 30 years, and giving it to the Ukrainians where it can actually be useful on the battlefield. So the idea that we are just pulling money out of thin air and giving it to the Ukrainians, money that would be going to other programs in the United States, is a fiction. We're giving them lethal aid primarily, which has been mothballed because it's out of date. It's obsolete by U.S. military standards. So it's a really good deal for the United States, and we should continue to do it. I don't think you need to attach a specific dollar amount number to that. And insofar as what the United States commitment to Ukraine should be in regards to the war with Russia, Ukraine needs a secure border more than the United States does at this moment. Ukraine has a very porous border because it has Russian troops coming over it. And they need to be able to secure that border in order to be a sovereign country. The United States is the only country that can really help them do that.
Jenny, I want to bring you back in here. General Chapman, who oversaw the southern border of the United States, realized over a period of time and after reviewing data that closing the border is actually what created the most immigration of Mexican immigrants permanently into the United States. That prior to closing the border, you had the seasonal movement of workers to work on farms in the United States, especially in places like California and the American South. And then during the winter months, actually migrate back home. And they were filling a necessary void in the US economy by providing their labor there where there was a shortage of American citizen workers. What do you make of having asylum be the policy that the Senate is considering once they come back, rather than perhaps more comprehensive citizenship paths or temporary work permits?
Well, I think the situation with temporary work permits is that they've tried to work on that for months, and the administration really hasn't helped calls from its own party to support that. You know, Eric Adams in New York City and other areas of the country, in Denver, for example, those cities have asked the Biden administration for that kind of help and haven't gotten what they need, which is expedited work permits. That's what they've asked for. But at the same time, the root of this issue, which is something the White House has also tasked the vice president with, we haven't heard anything on them addressing the root causes of migration since February of last year. So it's something that goes straight to the White House. And then in addition, the asylum talks, you know, right now the proposal that the White House is trying to negotiate involves bringing back a Title 42-like policy, which is expelling migrants pretty quickly from the border. But the Border Patrol agents that I've talked to in the last couple of days have said that that really just leads to a lot of recidivism. They don't face consequences for doing that. And so you see a lot of people keep trying to cross and then eventually get through by sneaking in and not facing any penalties.
Really
All
quickly,
right.
Jenny, what are you referring to when you say root causes of migration?
The root causes of migration is the strategy the Biden administration had put out and tasked the vice president with. She is trying to address several different areas that are causing migrants to come in Central America. So the economic issues, the corruption issues, the gang violence, things that they believe need to be addressed to stop the flow coming to the border.
All right, Jennie
Do you
Taer
think
and
we should
Charls
give
McBryde, thank you both so much for joining us. We'll be back with more Rising after this.